Trust by Humayun Abbas. Trust is not something caused, it is something developed. That is to say, what is called trust when it is slowly taught to animals by men who tame them, is not trust, but reliance. Real trust is different. Trust in God, too, is not taught to human beings by God. On the contrary, God gives men so many reasons to have lack of trust, calamities, uncertainties, loss of hope, that it could be said that God actually illustrates that trust in something or someone beneficial is not to be erected on happiness or good experiences alone. Similarly, the Sufi master does not pose as someone worthy of trust in the sense that clerics and others make sure that their externals and their behavior inspire the trust which is reliance. Such trust as the latter kind is only to be regarded as worthwhile if it has been tested. For this reason the Sufis have asked, how many friends would you have if you went from one to another, asking them to conceal a dead body? Trust is something which the Sufi postulant must find from within himself, in spite of what the superficialities seem to indicate. This is one reason that Sufi masters have even made themselves appear ridiculous or untrustworthy to intending disciples. No less a person than Sheikh Shibli said when approached by someone who wanted to be accepted as a student, "Repeat, there is no God but God, and Shibli is his prophet." This was in order to test whether his submission was servile or otherwise. One of the commonest manifestations of lack of trust in a teacher, constantly emphasized by Sufi masters, is when the disciple expects attention and instructions when he has not done what he should do as a precondition of these things. Sheikh Ajal Shirazi, as only one example of this important aspect of Sufism, spoke thus to an applicant who came in search of zikrs, litanies. "Do not allow for others what you will not allow for yourself. Desire for others what you desire for yourself." Some time later this man arrived at the master's door, asking for recitations to be given to him, saying that after all he was the Sheikh's disciple. "How can I give you the second lesson," asked the master, "when you have not observed the first one?" One of the most important aspects of the conception of trust is that this technical term implies an activity and a posture which in turn develops a capacity in the individual. Monks and others, including spiritual recluses, have spent whole lifetimes obsessed by the conception of trust, and thus been unable to pass to a further stage. In the teaching quoted by Hujwiri, this problem is illustrated by the account of Hallaj instructing the eminent Ibrahim Khawas. When Hallaj went to Kufa, he was visited by Khawas. Hallaj asked Khawas, "O Ibrahim, what have you obtained from your 2 decades of study of the Sufis?" Khawas said, "I have concentrated upon the doctrine of trust." Hallaj said, "You have wasted time in cultivating the spiritual. Where is the annihilation in unification?" Hujwiri explains that trust signifies an attitude and a reliance. If a man spends his whole life in remedying his spiritual nature, he will need another life for remedying his material nature, and his life will be lost before he has found a trace or vestige of God. The story of Sheikh Shirazi given above also underlines another characteristic of trust which is emphasized by the Sufi masters. People who cannot trust are themselves not trustworthy, and therefore cannot be entrusted with important things. The would-be disciple of Shirazi did not trust him to attend to the disciple's needs when they were manifested. In his turn, the intending disciple could not be trusted to exercise the attitudes which were prescribed for him at the first meeting. The disciple who asked Shirazi for further guidance was not exercising trust, as we have seen, but he may well have thought that he was asking the master to give him a trust, having failed to perceive that he had been given the first lesson before he could get the second. Indeed, trust is only the 4th stage of one version of the Sufi journey. The first is repentance from objectionable things, The second is returning to rightness. The third is renunciation, and then comes trust. The master's assessment of the applicant, put in terms of do not allow for others what you would not allow for yourself, desire for others what you desire for yourself, clearly covers the practices which would constitute these first three stages. The instructions given to a student by the master constitute the practice or practices necessary for him to complete the station in which he is to stand. Hence, in the words of Hujwiri, the disciple must abide by this stage, and his fulfillment of the obligation appertaining to that station, and his keeping it until he comprehends its perfection so far as lies in man's power, it is not permissible that he should quit his station without fulfilling the obligations thereof. Although the intending Sufi will have to trust his mentor sufficiently to accept his instructions as to the three stations which come before it, he will not be capable of real trust until he has completed the fourth. Nevertheless, there is sufficient capacity in students to exercise this limited trustworthiness. Trust itself, as Al-Ghazali has defined it, is made up of knowledge, state, and work. These three things constitute the attunement of the learner to that which has to be learnt. When a Sufi master is coaching disciples, whether by words, signs, or actions, he is preparing them to apply the attitude which is composed of these. The coaching of disciples to wean them from appearances, automatism, and reliance upon literalism has a very long history among the Sufis and may be regarded as a central requirement. Indeed, the ordinary person's certainty that seeing is believing has to be replaced by the Sufi for a greater flexibility of understanding before extra dimensions of the mind may be opened up. Sir Richard Burton, in his History of Sind, tells the story of the great Sufi master Bayezid and the courtesan. Bayezid's disciples revered him so much at the expense of what he was teaching that he decided that this conditioning would have to be broken. Men, as the Sufi saying has it, should not be respected at the expense of what they represent. One day, Bayezid was surrounded by a group of admiring followers who were wedded to the belief that piety was inseparable from appearance. Bayezid sent a message to a woman of ill fame to bring him some of his clothes which he had left with her, and to send an account of the money which he owed her. Similarly, Shamsuddin of Tabriz, teacher of Rumi, once asked a disciple as a test to lend him his wife. This necessary technique has caused imitators to claim that they are Sufi masters and encourage such people to deceive and defraud others. But the argument put forward in some circles that the practice should not therefore be allowed is not valid for at least two reasons. The first is that over the centuries, the ill effects of pretended Sufis have not been shown to cause intolerable havoc, any more than impostures of other miscreants. The second is that to invoke this principle is, in the words of a modern master, like forbidding free speech because villains might misuse it. An examination of the words and deeds of such Sufi masters as we have noted above, as well as time spent among the Sufis of the present day, abundantly show that 1. Trust is not civility. People tend to misunderstand trust. 2. Trust is needed before lessons can be learnt. 3. The kind of trust which is needed is stimulated by the master. 4. The master may stimulate this by words or action or writings. 5. Before this stage there are other stages, similarly stimulated. 6. Many people imagine that they seek knowledge, when in reality they only seek attention or something else which they have in the back of their minds. 7. The Sufi, knowing his would-be disciple, gives him or her instructions which both prepare him, her, and also enable him, her, and others to see whether this process is working. Firstly, by helping to reveal the true nature of the student's attitudes. 8. The learner comes to appreciate that the Sufi is rejecting certain kinds of approach and encouraging others, in order to help to bring the disciple's spiritual, not selfish nature to bear upon the problem of progress. In the words of Rumi, the master will not allow the disciple's self-conceit to operate, so that he is left on the teacher's hands like government soap. It is because he can appear to touch defilement and yet not be defiled, Anwari, that the master Sufi can afford to behave in a way which society does not readily allow others. Nothing, says Abu Turab al-Naqshbandi, can defile the Sufi, and he in fact purifies everything. Among the modern exponents of the Sufi way who have made the first stages possible through speech and publishing is the Afghan adept Idries Shah, whose works are appreciated in the East and West. In the past, such writers as Ghazali, 10th century, or Hujwiri, 11th century, and Rumi, 13th century, used the methods of tales, arguments, and discourses to provide the preliminary steps for the learner, to enable him to approach the stage of dervish, one who is on the path. Later Sufis, while continuing this process, have often allowed private visits, attendance at lectures, and personal instruction to help to carry the study further. The great expansion of printing and reading in the past few centuries, which have made possible a wide distribution of the earlier classics, have not completely succeeded in teaching postulants that they should prepare themselves for what the teacher in the flesh can convey by a careful study of his written work. It is still therefore very common for people to behave in the same way as the would-be disciple of the master Shirazi, seeking the second lesson before absorbing the first. One of the means adopted to stratify the steps for admission and progress in a graduated succession were the Sufist orders which came into being in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, with the passage of time, these have always concentrated upon a reductionist interpretation of the way, characteristic of institutionalization instead of a personal and flexible one. The demise of the orders as effective learning channels, however, has not abolished the teaching function, but only transferred it from the orders back to the traditional masters. Sufi Activity in the World Not of It, by Emir Ali Khan. The members of all communities, including nations and whole civilizations, are infused with the prevailing ideologies of those communities. These in turn create attitudes of mind which include certain capacities and equally positively exclude others. The ideologies may be so ancient, so deep-seated or so subtle that they are not identified as such by the people at large. In this case, they are often discerned only through a method of challenging them, asking questions about them, or by comparing them with other communities. Such challenge, description, or questioning, often the questioning of assumptions, is what frequently enables a culture or a number of people from that culture to think in ways that have been closed to most of their fellows. Traditionally, the Sufis have adopted the method of challenge and response to assist people to enlarge their development and increase their perceptions. Naturally, the challenge is not random, not challenge for the sake of challenge, or questioning in order to be destructive, or even description just to add to the sum total of information, but is, in its specificity, calculated to lead to an advance in the level of individual and communal knowledge. Burn that bar, depth and character of Sufi potential. Just as the mere adoption of Sufi externals does not help in any higher development, so is the only way to this development through the actual experiencing of sensations which do not resemble any others in the ordinary human experience. The Sufic current, it may be added, cannot be mixed with any other. Those who attempt to do this are only trying to achieve mixing on an emotional level, which is contraindicated in Sufi work. It is very common for those who have not been in contact with a legitimate Sufi school to try to amalgamate Sufi ideas, techniques, and so on with other thoughts and behavior patterns. This attempt in itself is evidence of low-level understanding which must be transcended before the school can communicate effectively with such an individual. The chief barrier to equal contact with the Sufi experience is the overdevelopment or overuse of imagination. As the Sufi teacher Rumi puts it, imagination blocks you like a bolt on a door. Burn that bar. The next obstacle in the harmonization of the Sufis with those who would participate in their experiences lies in the chaotic situation which exists in all societies, when the prevailing ideology, whether scholastic, religious or other, has removed the distinction between the three main kinds of knowledge, general, specialized and perceptive, as applied to human development. It is always a sign of a legitimate Sufi school when it attempts to restore these levels in study, just as it is a sign of a deteriorated tradition when the levels are not fully recognized by a community. The three kinds of knowledge. One of the most specific statements of these three levels was made by Al-Ghazali. Everyone, he taught, is in reality in one of three categories in respect to knowledge. First, he is a sharer in the general stock of knowledge, and what is called knowledge by the community in which he lives, the larger social world of his family, tribe, nation, civilization. Second, he may enter the ranks of those who understand more, who specialize. Third, he can enter the circle of those who have a realization of understanding through direct experience. These three levels are found, for instance, in the general idea of, say, being a blacksmith, then of learning how to become a blacksmith, and finally the experience of actually being a blacksmith. In the levels recognized in the Islamic spiritual philosophical tradition, the three circles correspond with the law, the path, and knowledge. Die before you die. The Sufi teaching is designed to accept the learner at level 1 and help him or her by means of the work of level 2 to reach level 3. Level 3 is that which is conceived as beyond what the Sufis call sleep, which is familiar life. It is the existence in which the human phase of being is only a part, and which can be seen as an interruption or stage, as sleep may be viewed as an interruption of wakefulness. Hence the slogan, "Die before you die," which means that stage 3 is the experiencing, before the end of ordinary human life, of the perennial existence which follows physical death. Do you need a furnace or a lamp? Like any other legitimate teaching, the Sufi way gives the student not what he or she may desire, but whatever is indicated as useful, to enable the passage from stage 1 to stage 3 to take place. This concentration upon specificity in progress is what distinguishes the Sufis from a cult or from any other form of self-indulgence purporting to be a way. Seek a furnace, but it would burn you, says Rumi, continuing, you only need the flame of a lamp. In cults and other activities designed for pleasure rather than progress, the sensation is what is sought, and the most intense one at that. The school, however, seeks enlightenment, not intensity. It is to the individual and the group which have decided to seek something through unregenerate and ignorant ambition that Sa'di speaks when he says, I fear you will never reach Mecca, O nomad, for you are on the road to Turkestan. The common occurrence of cults which imitate some Sufi techniques remaining at stage 1 while they think that they are approaching the 3rd stage is thus styled by Hafiz, another major teacher, a man must be a Solomon before his magical ring will work. Organization. The Sufi method of organization has a discernible pattern insofar as studies are concerned. This is as follows. The Sufi teacher presides over his own circle. Next comes the group. This is presided over by the deputy. Finally comes the individual membership, in which single individuals are linked to the teaching through the office. The totality of the membership is the path, often inaccurately called, in imitation of Western organizations, the order. The important point to remember in relation to the different forms of membership is that they are all considered to be equally important. In degenerate and imitation schools comprising people who do not understand the workings of a school, it is considered better to belong to the master's circle than to be a mere individual member. Such imaginings are borrowed from the first level of a primitive human organization and have no place in a school. The teacher or the society authorized by him attaches students and other members in accordance with an expert assessment to one or other forms of relationship, individual, circle, group, which must be varied from time to time to provide the necessary learning impulses. Since incomers generally have only the standards of Stage 1 as their opinion-forming instrument, it is common for some of them to demand to enter groups or circles, or to be individual members, or not to be such. People who adopt such an attitude are taken as valuing their assumptions above the expertise of the society, and generally discarded by the organization, which in Sufi terminology does not feel itself competent to deal with them. Terminology. In a Sufi school, the only Sufis are the realized end products. The Sufi, according to classical and legitimate definition, is the illuminate. To call oneself a Sufi, therefore, is incorrect. People who do so are not Sufis. People who do not may or may not be Sufis. Members, if they are part of self-organized groups or self-styled seekers, are known as dervishes, the poor, and sometimes form themselves into study groups or reading circles, pending acceptance by a regular school. In some cases, such bodies of students fail to obtain recognition, and their amateur schools may continue to exist even for centuries, being in reality cults or amusement bodies, though undetected as such in the community at large, which is generally only aware of Level 1 activity. Such organizations are even considered to be Sufi bodies, and scholars and others regularly study them in the mistaken belief that they constitute a part of the Sufi phenomenon. These groupings are usually identifiable because of their love of emotive names for themselves, for their dramatic ideas about truth or enlightenment, their attachment to symbols and other externals, and their excitable membership. In all these respects, they tend to be the opposite of the measured and effective Sufi group. A dervish group or individual, however, can possibly be attached usefully to such a school, but generally such wide-ranging reorganization is needed as to upset the pleasures of the members, and hence the likelihood of such a development is not strong. Rumi is direct in saying of them, "Let us leave such donkeys to their pastures." An Appraisal of Sufi Learning Methods by Benjamin Ellis Ford. The present climate of research and interest in traditional systems of life and learning greatly favors the study of those which have been preserved for centuries by the Sufis, a body of people commonly styled Islamic mystics, but whose teachings, both according to them and many, if not all, of their commentators, reach back into the human past beyond written records. Materials on the Sufis are contained in the books which their exponents have written, and in accounts by travellers and residents in the Middle East, where they have been chiefly located, which cover a period of approximately 1200 years under the name Sufi. The materials are so miscellaneous and for many confusing that it has never been possible, in spite of several intensive attempts, to provide a rationale of what the Sufis do, why, and in what manner, which will embrace all the acceptedly legitimate materials available. It is not a matter of too little material, but of too much. As one commentator has said, if we had handed down to us only a little about the Sufis, we would have been able to effect a plausible reconstruction of their ideas and practices, which might not have been accurate, but which would certainly have satisfied our desire for order and to close the books. Unfortunately, we cannot do this, for the materials are too abundant. Passing over this sad commentary upon our methods of running the profession of learning, it soon becomes apparent that sense may sometimes be made, even from such a complex manifestation as that of the Sufis, by seeking the information and interpretation from the Sufis themselves. This process, which the present author has followed as far as is humanly possible, reveals that there are, roughly speaking, two ways of looking at Sufi, and who knows, perhaps many other kinds of manifestations. 1. From the point of view of fixed assumptions which the researcher has brought with him into the equation, and 2. In accordance with what the Sufis themselves have to say about their activity. What follows is substantially the collection of interpretations about Sufis and Sufism, which originated in extensive travels and questionings, armed with questionnaires derived from the available books on the Sufis, which have been written by experts. It is not too much to say that the Sufis have been considerably surprised at the lack of information and lackluster mentality of the average researcher. The first obvious matter of interest is contained in the question and its answer. What are the Sufis for? Why do they exist? And what are they trying to do? In this, happily, there seems to be no confusion on the part of the Sufis, whatever motives, history or objectives the specialists may care to father upon them. The Sufis, according to statements which command the acceptance of their own authorities, know how to dispel those things which stand between the human being and his or her perception of human origin and destiny, setting aside as irrelevant to this journey the division between life before birth, during life as we know it, and after death. The Sufi assertion is that humanity was created for a purpose, knew what this purpose was before assuming what is characterized as the human guise, forgot what this was at the point of birth, starts to remember it under appropriate stimuli, and continues to exist after physical death in a sense which has been modified by the terrestrial phase. Although this formulation may sound to contemporary ears like something out of science fiction, it was well established and widely credited in this form many centuries before the devising of the science fiction genre, with all that that implies. Sufis deny the absolute reality of time, space, and physical form. These things, they say, are both relative and local. They only appear to be absolute. This, then, is the Sufi assertion. What of the application of methods to encourage the awakening, Sufi phrase, of the sleeper, their word for man? The Sufi answer to this differs so dramatically from all other religio-mystical conceptions that it is perhaps not surprising that some people cannot really grasp it. And yet it does not seem, once grasped, to be incompatible with any veracity of the basic argument. They say, in brief, that when the knowledge of how past, present, and future are connected is experienced by the Sufi master, it is his ability to devise the methods. Further, such methods are not only unstandardized, they must be so. As the Sufi phrase has it, there are as many paths to truth as there are souls of men. The Sufi, therefore, regards systems which treat everyone alike as mechanical and degenerate. They do not deny either that many supposedly Sufi entities have become oversimplified to such an extent after falling into the hands of imitators that they have lost the power to do more than automatize their followers. This indeed they regard as an inevitable consequence of the effects of time itself. In other words, our desire for order and our haste to organize leads to a demand for oversimplification which causes teaching to become indoctrination and originally meaningful activity to become ritual. It is difficult to reverse this process and to reclaim flexibility because of a demand for order which is so powerful, as are many of the lower-level aspirations, that it grips its victims like a disease. The Sufi approaches his task from whatever point he is able. The first consideration in many cases is the observation that people in general are so habituated to making habits that everything presented to a human being will be warped by him into a habit. The answer to this, according to the Sufi, is not to break habits, because many habits are important. The solution is to guide the learner to a position in which he can both have habits and manage to operate without them. The analogy which is used by modern Sufis is of an automatic mechanism which has an override which enables it to be operated at will. This in turn leads to one of the most baffling aspects of Sufi activity, discontinuity. The Sufi claims that in addition to rhythm and its effects, there are phases within the human being which can be contacted and employed to enable him to think, to work, and to exist outside of familiar time and repetitiousness. Human beings, however, have an affinity for repetition. The Sufi techniques explore the switchover from continuity to discontinuity by a large number of devices, both literary, physical, and mental. Many of Sufi exercises are in fact based upon this conception. It follows from this that people who are not able to switch attention from repetition to discontinuity will not be able to benefit from such techniques, even if they know what they are. It is for this reason that a Sufi teacher is always needed. Unregenerate man will always automatize inputs, and only someone who is consciously outside of time as well as within it can hold the line. The second training requirement that is marked among the Sufi teachers is based upon an understanding of the tendency to accept or to reject. Most human institutions are based upon the binary mode either-or. Faced with almost any situation, the human being will automatically decide, as quickly as possible, whether to accept or reject it. This, say the Sufis, provides a useful tool for ordinary learning and indoctrination, but when it becomes the only mode of approach to a situation, it effectively screens the individual from other perceptions, other areas of experience where this mode is absent. The attempt at introducing a middle way in decision, evaluation, and so on only imports an uncertainty into the situation and does not, they aver, constitute the establishment of a third, specific potentiality, which they hold to be essential. Vanity and self-assertion, which have been struggled against, one feels generally with little success, by virtually every religion, are also regarded by the Sufis as harmful to the realization process. They do not, however, stress the reward and punishment aspect of too much vanity. To them, vanity is a barrier to learning. Not to be able to learn or to progress is just as deadly for the Sufi as being damned or ceasing to exist is in other dispensations. The initial training among the Sufis, concentrating upon modesty and repentance, is indeed held by them to be both the essential foundation of all human spiritual progress, and also certainly in their eyes the original teaching of which the religionized versions, mere emotional or social blackmail, are degenerations. After modesty comes symbolism. I have time and again noted that genuine Sufis are almost baffled that those who copy them are unaware that the Sufi teachings contain layer upon layer of meanings, and that one cannot pass to a second meaning until a primary one has been absorbed. The consequence of the failure of the imitators to understand this, even in theory, is that for the Sufi no outside inquirer is able to make any progress at all in real Sufism, but remains, as it were, churning up the surface of the water like a pond fly, while at the same time making journeys all over the East, teaching others because of his experiences, writing books, doing dervish dances, and generally behaving in a manner which the Sufi himself regards as first-class evidence of incompetence and superficiality. One of the reasons for the well-known penchant of the Sufis for discouraging admirers or applicants for knowledge is to force them to re-examine the real depth of their knowledge and sincerity. It may take, one Sufi told me, 5 or even more approaches covering several years before we have been able to signal effectively enough to the applicant that we would be glad to help him if he would only amend his own feelings of self-importance. What proportion of those who are thus diverted actually return that number of times, I asked him. Less than 1 in 10. 9 will decide that we are nasty people. Some even go away quite unconscious that they have been reproached, so vain are they, and start to teach. But if the foregoing special characteristics of the Sufis cause general alarm or confusion, this is nothing to the degree of misunderstanding which originates in another typical feature of Sufi practice. I refer to the fact that there are many apparently different systems of Sufi study. Not only are there reported musical and rhythmic assemblies, there are formulations which appear to show that Sufis dislike music or favour it, that they practice loud or only silent invocations, that there are 6, 9, 10, 17 and any other number of stages and stations of the way. Some people say that they work on activating sensitive perception spots on the head and body, like the yoga chakras. Others hold that Sufi methods require repetitions, memorizing, and almost any kind of spiritual or other practice which you can imagine. How can this be? The real answer, which is not to be found in any of the 2,250 books or monographs on the subject which I have studied, comprising effectively the entire bibliography of Sufism which the world can offer, is amazingly simple. All one has to do is to ask a real Sufi. Sufis, the answer goes, will employ any method in their teaching which will actually work. They are not tied to any traditional formula whatever. The use of so many different kinds of methods by various teachers has given rise to the assumption that such and such a method is the real way among imitators. So if nowadays you ask one of the many thousands of imitators, or sincere but misled followers of one-time imitators, as to the facts about the standardization of method among Sufis, they will give you the answer which does not originate with the Sufis at all, but with the dervishes, people who have tried, usually unsuccessfully, to become Sufis. What is interesting about the fact that Sufi teachers choose their own techniques is that the fact that this is possible at all tends to support the Sufi assertion that the Sufi actually knows the way from having trodden it. In contradistinction, the very fact that people in other systems cleave so strongly to repetition, traditionalism and rote, imitation and ritual, could well be taken to mean that the actual insight as to what actually does work is absent. This point is worth pondering. Worth pondering, of course, it may be. Whether it will be pondered is another matter. The reason for this unlikelihood, it seems to me, is that in most human societies there is little conception that there may be a way which is open and which is known and understood by its sponsors. In the West, for instance, the reverence for authority and the attachment to fixed forms must surely stem from a subconscious belief that there is no access to truth today, only repetition of what people in the past have said one should do and believe. Similarly, in the Far East, traditionalism surely spells conviction that what was once done and believed must surely produce results today. The existence of people who say, as it were, forget tradition, follow experience, must be very small, otherwise we would not find it hard to keep in our minds the possibility that some may be able to do something without particular, frequent, or even plausible reference to standard authorities. Sufi teaching techniques in their true form depend very much upon an interrelation between master and disciple, and between these two and the whole community of mystics. The current which flows between these, according to the Sufis, is the most important element in their being and progress. Given this statement, it is possible to discern that many so-called Sufi groupings and teachers are in fact no such thing, for the element of current is absent. The sporadic nature of the Sufi activity, when there may be a lecture or a series of exercises, there may be a lecture or distinct instruction, or there may not, from time to time in a real Sufi school ties in with this current. The fluctuation of activity parallels the fluctuation of potentiality and the knowledge of the teacher in a way which is not found, so far as I'm aware, in any other system. This does not necessarily prove that the Sufi system is true or superior, but it does imply a strong distinction which is not noted, so far as I'm aware, in the literature. This characteristic of fluctuation leads naturally into another of the strange aspects of Sufi teaching organization. The strangeness lies in the fact that unlike any other mystical or philosophical systems, Sufis often organize their studies around communities and enterprises which are not instantly recognizable as spiritual. Everyone, for instance, in the East and West, knows what a monastery is. As a settlement or collection of people, it may well run enterprises of an economic kind: agriculture, beekeeping, the manufacture of wines or spirits, various crafts. But these activities are always looked upon as things which help to contribute to the upkeep of the foundation. With the Sufis, however, they, strangely, operate all kinds of enterprises. A Sufi school may be centered around a colony of tinsmiths, or a factory, a shop, or even the running of a large house and grounds. Even some of the repetitious and formalized groupings sometimes retain vestiges of this concept. Among the Bektashis, for instance, are to be found the relics of a family, with certain functionaries known as the cook, the groom, and so on. In Central Asia, this tradition is perpetuated in name, though not in action, by the use of the term family to style a Sufi group. A very large number of ancient Sufi organizations stem from chivalry, another format, with tabards still being carried, they know not why, by wandering dervishes in Iran, and swords hanging on the walls of tekias, Sufi meeting places, as widely dispersed as Bosnia and Xinjiang. The reason for the different formats, in addition to the fact that they signal the teacher's flexibility to teach within any framework, is that the principle of fluctuation within form must be maintained. That is to say, if the teacher has to maintain contact and a relationship with his followers while waiting, as it were, for propitious times to carry out the practices which alone bring enlightenment, he must have a form with which to maintain the coherence of the group. In deteriorated systems, that form is wholly religious. People wear special clothes, pray, and meditate and so on at stated times. They have, in fact, become automatized. With the Sufis, on the other hand, the primary need is to keep the decks clear for the moment when the teaching can take place. This requires that the attention should be focused upon the teaching only when it is able to operate, while other activities are carried out in the intervening time. Seen from one perspective, of course, this all means that the Sufis are creating a socio-economic group which fulfills the function of, as they say, being in the world, but not of it, yet at the same time not exhausting the spiritual energy by dwelling on emotional and evocative thoughts, prayers, litanies, readings, and so on, which operate on people in a conditioning manner. It has to be admitted that the principle underlying this interesting organization might lead one to suppose that there really is one unusual insight at work. The abandonment or absence of the principle in virtually all other spiritually orientated societies should not blind us to the possibility that here we find a method and a knowledge that could really be almost unknown elsewhere. Is this the Sufi secret? The existence of these organizations, of course, depends, according to the Sufis, upon the existence of Sufis with the necessary knowledge to set up what seem to be profane organizations, but which are yet subtly related with the teaching, the disciples, and the outside world. Since the reality behind seemingly non-religious entities was announced some years ago by the Sufi authority Idries Shah, some attempts have been made to set up supposedly Sufi farms, camps, business, and so on, almost always by people who are merely imitating. As has been noted with regard to Sufis many times in the past, the compulsion to imitate is not always a sign of deceit, though it is almost always invariably a sign of immaturity. Readers are warned, therefore, not to adopt just any Sufi organization because it claims to be working along the lines of worldly organization with an inner content. All authentic Sufis are in direct contact, and there is in the world at any one moment only one Sufi entity which manipulates the totality of the Sufi activity. The existence of such a finely tuned instrument as a total Sufi organization, with its own organs of communication and its own programs founded upon direct perception of truth beyond appearances, of course makes nonsense of almost all our attempts to study Sufis through secondary sources. Further, it makes laughable the careful examination of Sufi prayers, exercises and methods, which are looked at in isolation. A Sufi, if he is working in attunement with a total operation, will never be able to indicate, any more than an observer can perceive, what the actual function of the said exercise, etc., really is, for it is nothing at all when torn from context.